When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the world thought the fighting was over. Japan had surrendered, the atomic bomb had ended the war, and peace had returned to the Pacific. But for some soldiers of the empire, the war never truly ended. They were scattered across distant islands, forgotten, isolated, and still loyal to an emperor who had already surrendered. These men would come to be known as Japan's holdouts. And their story is one of loyalty, isolation, and tragedy unlike any other in history. In the final days of the war, Japan's vast empire stretched from China to New Guinea, from the Philippines to the remote jungles of the Pacific. When Japan capitulated, tens of thousands of troops were cut off, stranded without communication. For many, surrender was unthinkable. From childhood, they had been taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, and that surrender was the ultimate shame. So when the surrender order came, many refused to believe it was real. Some thought it was an Allied trick. Others simply never heard the message. And in the thick jungles and distant atolls, small bands of Japanese soldiers continued to live, fight, and hide, for years, even decades after the war's end. On tiny Pacific islands, reports began to emerge. Fishermen attacked, patrols ambushed, and mysterious figures vanishing into the trees. At first, the Allied occupation forces dismissed them as rumors. But they were real, men still fighting a war that no longer existed. One of the first discovered was in 1947, on Morotai Island in Indonesia. 2 Japanese soldiers were found still guarding their outpost, unaware the war had ended 2 years before. When told Japan had surrendered, they broke down in disbelief. For them, the world they knew, the cause they'd fought for, had already vanished. But for others, the war continued far longer. On Guam, in the thick jungle, a soldier named Shoichi Yak would hide for nearly 3 decades. He built bamboo traps, wove clothing from tree bark, and survived by eating frogs, rats, and coconuts. He believed that even in retreat, a soldier must never bring shame upon his country. For 28 years, he waited for orders that would never come. When he was finally discovered in 1972, he told his rescuers, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." That one sentence captured the spirit of Japan's lost army, proud, disciplined, and tragically bound by duty. Yet Yak was not alone. Across the Pacific, more stories would unfold, some ending peacefully, others violently. In the Philippines, small groups of Japanese soldiers held out for years after 1945. They hid in caves, lived off the land, and ambushed patrols they believed to be the enemy. Leaflets were dropped from the sky announcing Japan's surrender. But many refused to believe them, thinking it was Allied propaganda. To them, surrender was impossible. Only death or victory were honorable. As years turned into decades, these holdouts became legends, ghosts of a lost war. Villagers whispered about them. Occasionally, one would come down from the mountains to steal food, then vanish again into the jungle. Local authorities tried to convince them the war was over, sometimes even bringing family members to plead with them. But for most, the indoctrination ran too deep. They believed Japan would one day return, and that they must be ready. The most famous of all would be found on the Philippine island of Lubang, a man named Hiroo Onoda. He was an intelligence officer, trained in guerrilla warfare and psychological resistance. When the war ended in 1945, he and a small group of soldiers were still operating on the island. They ignored surrender leaflets, believing them to be enemy tricks. They continued to raid farms and police stations, always retreating back into the mountains. For years, they evaded capture. And for nearly 30 years, Onoda's personal war would continue, long after Japan itself had risen from the ashes. By the 1950s, Hiroo Onoda and his men were the last remnants of an empire that no longer existed. One by one, his comrades were killed in skirmishes with local police or by starvation and illness. Still, Onoda refused to surrender. He saw himself as a soldier under orders. And until he received those orders from a superior officer, the war was not over. For him, time had stopped in 1945. While Japan rebuilt into a modern democracy, Onoda was still in the jungle, cleaning his rifle and watching the skies for enemy planes. He recorded each event in a tattered notebook, the moon phases, the patrols, and every rumor of war. To him, it was all real. Local villagers feared him. For decades, reports of Japanese soldiers in the hills reached Manila, but most were dismissed. Then, in 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set out to find him. Suzuki was an adventurer, and he made it his mission to locate Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. Amazingly, he succeeded. In the dense Lubang jungle, he found Onoda, still wearing his old uniform, still carrying his rifle in perfect condition. Onoda refused to surrender to a civilian. He would only surrender if ordered to do so by his commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan and found that officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a bookseller living a quiet life. Taniguchi agreed to travel to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, nearly 30 years after the end of World War II, he stood before his former subordinate and gave him the order he had waited for. "Lieutenant Onoda, the war is over. You are to lay down your arms." Onoda saluted, wept, and surrendered his rifle. When he returned to Japan, he was greeted as both a hero and a relic of another era. Some praised his loyalty. Others pitied his tragedy. He had lost 3 decades of his life to a war that ended before he was even 30 years old. But even Onoda was not the last. A few months later, another Japanese soldier, Teruo Nakamura, was discovered on a remote Indonesian island, still living in a small hut, still convinced he was serving the emperor. He was the final known holdout of the Imperial Japanese Army. He returned home quietly, his story barely noticed compared to Onoda's. Yet together, they marked the end of a generation that had lived by a code the modern world could no longer understand. The lost soldiers of Japan were more than survivors. They were symbols of a vanished age. Their stories reveal the extreme power of loyalty, discipline, and belief. They fought for an emperor who no longer ruled, for a country that no longer needed them, and for a war that no longer existed. Decades after their surrender, the jungles where they once hid have grown silent again. But in the rusted rifles, the faded uniforms, and the quiet ruins they left behind, echoes of their devotion still remain. They remind us that wars do not always end when the shooting stops. Sometimes they live on in the hearts of those who cannot let go. These were Japan's forgotten warriors, the last soldiers of the empire. Men who never surrendered, even when their world had already disappeared. And in their tragic loyalty, they became legends of a war that refused to die.